Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to get you quickly up to speed, really well informed, without you having to sift through tons of info.
That's the goal. Straight to the point.
And today we're doing something a bit special. It's part of our CSWIP 3.1 exam prep series.
Yep, aimed right at helping you get ready for that CSWIP 3.1 Welding Inspector Exam.
Think of it like a focused study session. We'll hit some key points, hopefully trigger a few aha moments for you.
Definitely.
So here's how we'll do it. We've got some multi-choice questions, very much like what you'll see on the real exam.
The classic format.
I'll read out the question and the options. Then we'll discuss the right answer, but more importantly, why it's right. We want you to really get the principles behind it.
It's not just memorizing answers, it's understanding the concepts. That's what makes the difference.
Exactly. We're going to look at some of those, unseen factors and choices that really matter for weld integrity. Okay.
Sounds good. Let's dive in.
All right, let's jump right into our first challenge. Question 1. The unit of joules would be used to measure a tensile strength, B, impact energy, C, hardness, or D, electrical resistance.
Okay.
Take a second. Joules. What property springs to mind, especially thinking about materials and welding?
Right. Well, the answer here is definitely B, impact energy.
Impact energy.
Yeah. Joules are the standard unit for energy, right? So in material science, we use it to measure impact energy. Think of it as how much energy a material can absorb from a sudden whack, basically, before it breaks.
Like a shock absorption test.
Exactly. It's all about toughness. Really crucial for anything that gets hit or vibrates a lot or operates in the cold where things get brittle. You need that energy absorption to avoid, sudden failure.
Makes sense.
And just to contrast quickly, tensile strength, that's about resisting being pulled apart, usually measured in pascals or PSI. Hardness is resistance to denser scratches, think Rockwell or Vickers scales. And electrical resistance, that's obviously about how much it fights electric current measured in ohms. So joules fits perfectly with impact energy, that resistance to certain shock.
Ah, okay. So understanding a material's impact energy is a fundamental piece of the puzzle for ensuring the safety and reliability of welded structures, isn't it? Especially with those dynamic loads you mentioned.
Absolutely critical. It's not just about strength. It's about resilience to sudden events. And welding itself can change this property locally, so it's something inspectors really need to understand. Joules tells you how ready that material is for surprise impact.
Got it. Foundational stuff. Okay, let's switch from material properties to the welding process itself. How our choices there can create risks.
Good transition.
Question 2. Which of the following processes would be most prone to lack of fusion defects? A pulsed arc MIG, B, spray transfer MIG, C, dip transfer MIG, or D, submerged arc?
Lack of fusion.
Yeah, thinking about how these work, which one stands out as being maybe a bit notorious for this particular defect?
Okay, for this one, the process you really need to watch for lack of fusion is AC dip transfer MIG.
Dip transfer. Why is that?
Well, the thing about dip transfer is it runs at a pretty low heat input, relatively speaking. The wire actually touches the weld pool, short circuits, melts off, and repeats. It's great for thin stuff or out-of-position work because it's cooler.
Right, less heat.
But that lower energy input is the problem. Sometimes it's just not enough heat to properly melt the base metal, especially if you're on thicker material or doing a root pass where good fusion is absolutely vital. Poor technique makes it even worse. You end up with areas that just haven't melted together. Classic lack of fusion.
Okay, so the low energy is the key risk factor there.
Definitely. Now compare that to the others. Spray transfer MIG, that uses high voltage, high current, sprays tiny droplets across the arc, lots of heat, deep penetration, usually excellent fusion.
Much hotter.
Yeah. Pulsed arc MIG is kind of a smart hybrid, controls the heat well, generally gives good fusion. And submerged arc, CSW, that's a real powerhouse. High currents, deep penetration, usually no issues with fusion there. So dip transfer's low energy nature makes it the most susceptible.
That's a really clear explanation.
Yeah.
But hang on, if dip transfer MIG is so prone to this, why do we see it used so much? What keeps it popular?
Yeah, that's a great practical point. It stays popular because of that low heat input, paradoxically. Like I said, it's fantastic for thin sheet metal, minimizes warping. It's good for bridging gaps in root passes without burning through. And it's easier to control overhead or vertically because the puddle isn't as fluid.
Ah, so it has its place.
Exactly. It's not inherently bad, but you have to use it correctly within its limits. An inspector needs to know if someone's using dip transfer on thick plate, especially for critical joints, the alarm bells for lack of fusion should be ringing loud and clear. Lower heat equals higher risk for that defect.
Fascinating. A tool's strength being its weakness in another context really drives home why inspectors need that process knowledge. Okay, let's dig into some material science basics with question 3.
All right.
Question 3. Recrystallization during annealing is used to make steel. A softer, B harder, C tougher, or D stronger.
Okay, fundamental heat treatment.
Yeah. What's the main goal when we talk about recrystallization in annealing?
The answer here is pretty clear-cut. It's a softer.
Softer, okay.
Annealing is all about carefully controlling the steel's microstructure. You heat it up past its recrystallization point, but not melting it. Hold it there, and then this is important, cool it down slowly.
Oh, cool.
Right. During that process, new stress-free grains form and grow, replacing any distorted grains from, say, previous cold working. This whole change does a few things. It gets rid of internal stresses, makes the steel much more ductile, meaning it can bend without breaking.
More flexible.
Exactly. And critically, it significantly reduces the hardness, makes it softer, easier to machine, easier to form, get it ready for whatever comes next.
So it's primarily about making it more workable.
Precisely. While other treatments aim for hardness, like quenching, or toughness, like tempering, the main point of recrystallization during annealing is definitely softening the steel. It's often done before welding to make fabrication easier.
Right, so if a piece comes in annealed, an inspector might expect it to be easier to prep and weld. Less risk of cracking, maybe.
Generally, yes. Increased ductility and reduced internal stress are good things for weldability. It's less likely to crack. It'll be easier to machine the joint prep.
But maybe not as strong ultimately.
Correct. It's softer, so its yield strength might be lower than, say, a hardened steel. If the final part needs high strength, it might need heat treatment after welding too. So the inspector needs to understand the material's history, you see. Annealing resets things, makes it workable, but you need to know if that reset state is the final desired state or just an intermediate step.
That really shows how material science and inspection go hand in hand. Knowing the before helps predict the during and after. Okay, let's tackle question 4, back to welding parameters.
Let's do it.
Question 4. Poor penetration would be found in MIG-MAG welded steels when using A, argon plus 20% CO2, B, CO2, C, pure argon, or D, argon plus 5% CO2.
Ah, shielding gases. Critical choice.
Absolutely. So thinking about welding steel, which of these gases is likely to give you trouble with penetration?
Okay, the culprit here for poor penetration on steel is C, pure argon.
Pure argon. Why is that? Isn't argon common?
It is, but usually not pure argon for steel MIG-MAG. What happens is pure argon creates a kind of narrow, focused arc. And compared to CO2 or mixtures, it doesn't transfer heat into the steel as effectively. Its thermal conductivity is lower in this context.
So the arc is there, but the heat isn't getting in as well.
Exactly. You get this sort of finger-like penetration, often shallow, and the weld doesn't wet out onto the steel surface very well. It just makes it really hard to get good fusion and deep enough penetration, especially on anything thicker than sheet metal. That's why pure argon is great for aluminum, but not steel.
Right, different metals, different needs.
Precisely. Now look at the others. Pure CO2. That's a reactive gas. It breaks down in the arc and creates a much broader, hotter arc, gives you significantly deeper penetration.
Okay.
And the mixtures, like argon plus 20% CO2 or argon plus 5% CO2, those are the standard choices for steel. They give you the best of both worlds. The nice, stable arc from the argon, plus the better penetration and wetting from the CO2 component. They're engineered for good results on steel.
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
So how does this actually play out, like, on the shop floor? Could a welder mistakenly use pure argon on steel without realizing the penetration issue right away? Seems like a hidden problem.
Oh, absolutely. It can definitely be a hidden variable. Maybe a gas bottle is mislabeled, or someone just grabs the wrong one out of habit using the aluminum gas on a steel job.
Oops.
Yeah. And the weld might even look okay on the surface, decent bead appearance sometimes. But underneath, you've got that lack of penetration, which is a major structural flaw waiting to happen. So an inspector who really knows their stuff about shielding gases, why certain ones are chosen, they'll be checking procedures, gas lines, flow rates. It's fascinating, isn't it, how this seemingly small choice of gas directly impacts the physics of the arc and the integrity of the final weld.
It really is incredible how these details stack up.
Okay.
Let's move to our final question for this session. This one's about a specific defect.
All right.
Question 5. Lamellar tearing has occurred in a steel fabrication. Before welding, could it have been found by X-ray examination? B, dye penetrant. C, ultrasonic inspection, or D, day. It would not have been found by any inspection method.
Lamellar tearing. A tricky one.
Yeah, this really tests understanding when defects form. Could you have spotted this before any welding started?
Okay, the key here and the correct answer is art. It would not have been found by any inspection method.
Not at all. Why not?
Because lamellar tearing is a defect that is caused by the welding process itself. It doesn't exist before you weld. It happens typically during cooling, right after welding, mostly in thick, rolled steel plates. What happens is you get these strong pulling stresses through the thickness of the plate caused by the weld shrinking as it cools. These stresses pull on weak spots already in the steel specifically, elongated non-metallic inclusions like manganese sulfides that got lined up during the rolling process. The stress pulls the steel apart along these lines of weakness.
So the welding creates the tear along pre-existing weak lines.
Exactly. The weak lines are there, but the tear only forms when the welding stress is applied, so you can't find a tear that hasn't happened yet.
Right. And the other methods, why wouldn't they work beforehand?
Well, X-ray. That finds internal flaws after welding. It can see cracks, porosity, yes, but the tear isn't there pre-weld.
Okay.
Dye penetrant, that's for surface-breaking defects only. Lamellar tearing is usually subsurface and again not present before welding.
Makes sense.
Ultrasonic inspection, UT. Now this is interesting. UT can detect internal flaws, and it might detect clusters of those inclusions that make the steel susceptible, so it could potentially identify a risk area.
Ah, so it might hint at the possibility.
It might hint at the susceptibility, yes, but it won't find the actual tear before the welding stresses create it, so you can't detect the defect itself beforehand.
So if you can't spot the tear itself beforehand, what's an inspector looking for then? How do you manage this risk? It sounds like prevention is everything.
Exactly. Prevention is absolutely key. Since you can't find the tear before it forms, you focus on identifying and mitigating the risks. And inspectors should look at the material certs. Is it a clean steel with low sulfur? High sulfur means more inclusions, higher risk.
Check the material.
Check the joint design. Is it a highly restrained joint, like a T-butt or a corner joint, where those through thickness stresses will be really high? Maybe the design needs changing to reduce stress.
Look at the stresses.
And check the welding procedure. Are they using preheat to slow the cooling rate? Is the heat input controlled properly? All these things minimize the stresses that cause the tearing. So it's about understanding the contributing factors and ensuring the design and procedures are right for the material. That's the inspector's main defense.
That's a fantastic point. It's not just defect detection, it's understanding the whole life cycle risk, cause, prevention. Brilliant.
It's about proactive quality assurance, not just reactive inspection.
Wow. Okay, so we covered a lot there. From basic units like joules right through to complex defects like lamellar tearing, and how things like shielding gas or heat treatment play a massive role.
Yeah, we really touched on how material properties, process choices, and even the underlying physics all come together.
Absolutely. So what does this all mean for you preparing for that CSWIP 3.1 exam? Well, hopefully, breaking down these questions helps build that deeper understanding, that confidence.
Every question tackled is definitely a step forward. It's about connecting these dots.
It really is. Knowing this stuff isn't just about passing an exam. It's about being able to anticipate issues and ensure structures are safe and reliable.
And I think what's really striking is how interconnected it all is. These details, gas choice, heat treatment, joint design, they aren't isolated. They all fundamentally influence the final quality and safety in the real world. It's a complex system.
Totally agree. Keep digging into those connections.
And maybe a final thought to chew on. How might a subtle change, say, in the steel manufacturing process upstream, something seemingly unrelated, actually change the risk profile for a defect like lamellar tearing long before a welder even picks up a torch? How far back do the influences go?
Oh, that's a great question. Thinking about the whole life cycle. Excellent point.
Keep exploring, keep asking why.
Definitely. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into CSWIP 3.1 prep. Keep that curiosity going, keep learning, and we'll catch you on the next one.